Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Goulder, a contributing editor with Tax Notes. In the field of taxation, the talk of the summer has been this July 1st announcement we received from the OECD Inclusive Framework concerning a tentative agreement on their Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 proposals. And just quickly, by way of background, if you don't already know, Pillar 1 is a new nexus and profit attribution standard, and Pillar 2 is a global minimum tax. But if you're watching this, you probably already know about that. Now, there are many details that still need to be worked out, but thus far, over 130 jurisdictions have signed on to this, reflecting broad political buy-in from what can only be described as a diverse range of stakeholders. A lot of skeptics, myself included, never thought that this OECD project would really get this far, and yet here we are, heading into the fall of the year with a viable agreement that would fundamentally change how profits are taxed. Well, it's worth remembering that these proposed reforms are the result of complex economic diplomacy. And like any other negotiation, there's going to be give and take. And that's really the theme of our discussion today, to take a closer look at some of those trade-offs. And our guest is a leading expert in the field of international taxation, someone who's been scrutinizing the OECD project since its inception. She is Ruth Mason, professor of law and taxation at the University of Virginia School of Law in Charlottesville, and of course, a frequent writer to Tax Notes. She wrote our featured article for this month, which is entitled The 2021 Compromise. Now, it's excellent reading, and it might even change the way you think about these OECD pillars and the reason why so many governments around the world seem drawn to them. Professor Mason, thank you for joining us on In the Pages.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, it's funny, when you think about the history of tax, there are several high-profile compromises over the years. If we go back to the early 1960s, there was a famous compromise between the Kennedy administration and Congress that resulted in the Subpart F regime that was highly influential, influenced the generations of tax planning. And going back even further, almost 100 years to the period just after the end of World War I, there was the League of Nations and the compromises they reached for the so-called international consensus, which forged the basic tenets of how we divide up taxing rights between source countries and residence countries. And if things go according to plan, and who knows how this will eventually play out, but we might be able to add a third great compromise to that list, apropos of the title of your article. But before we get into the specifics of it, I want to go back a bit to what comes before the OECD Inclusive Framework. If you go back a few years, there was this BEPS project, right? The OECD Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project. And in your article, you have a telling comment here. You describe it as having a pragmatic credo. And to paraphrase you, that credo is agree on the things you can agree on, otherwise move on. Now, why didn't that work?
So to a large extent, I think it did work, right? So there was a lot of agreement. So wherever agreement could be reached, it was reached. And so really the question is about then, what are the places where the countries moved on, right? And, you know, the problem is that the countries don't really move on, or they don't move on in every case. So take BEPS action item 1, taxation of the digital economy. So the countries essentially just couldn't agree as to how to deal with the, what the OECD countries call the digitalization of the economy. And so they essentially agreed to disagree. They said, the digital economy can't be ring fenced from the rest of the economy and has to be dealt with as a piece, as part of the whole rest of the negotiation. And so the agreement was essentially move on. But what you saw, even contemporaneous with the BEPS, the first BEPS project, was the adoption of unilateral actions. So diverted profits taxes, equalization taxes, digital taxes. These are all examples of what I would call not moving on. And so, these unilateral actions ended up creating a kind of productive tension Once companies understood that they were going to be subject to these unilateral measures that were complicated and potentially would lead to double tax, that made them more receptive to negotiated solutions. And so you essentially had business coming on side with politicians in a way that made possible more deeper reforms.
Okay, so out of BEPS action item 1 on the digital economy, you said in the article there's not much of a gap, really. I mean, BEPS ends and they don't wait too long. They realize that there's this lingering issue about the digital economy, and they get right into the inclusive framework. You write that, and I'm paraphrasing you here, not a literal quote, but paraphrasing you, no country got all it wanted, but none walked away empty-handed. But 133 countries, they're very diverse countries here. You're talking about the United States, you're talking about countries of the European Union, the so-called BRICS, some less developed countries. Could you work through this idea of this trade-offs about the countries getting something, the important things for them, but not getting other things, particularly for the United States?
Okay, so the first thing to observe is nobody's gotten anything yet, right? So we have this agreement in principle. What we got on July 1st was sort of, here's where we are. But for any country to actually get anything out of this deal is going to require further steps, changes to treaties at a minimum. Okay, but what are the countries anticipating? What are they looking forward to? This compromise comes out of, in part, the pressure exerted by digital taxation, the pressure on the United States exerted by the digital services taxes that were adopted by lots of different countries. So the United States wants to get rid of these digital taxes, but the countries that have the digital taxes would like the same companies to be taxed as were taxed under the digital taxes, digital services taxes. So one of the things, what most important things that the United States got was Pillar 1, as it's currently formulated, doesn't tax just digital companies. Okay, it's pitched generally. So that's one of the things that the United States really wanted, because digital is such a historic strength for the United States. But this isn't just important for the United States. This is important more generally, in my view. So digital taxes are distorted, right? Any kind of sectoral tax that singles out a particular industry is going to distort investment in that industry. But also, these taxes, I argued in the pages of tax notes that, these digital services taxes, I argued this with Leo Parada of Leeds, that those taxes may cause trouble under EU law as nationality discrimination. But probably most important is that by making the nexus and the amount in Pillar 1 general, the countries have helped future-proof this rule. This is going to be, if it happens, the most important treaty reform in recent memory. And so by defining the scope in terms of revenue and profitability thresholds, the countries reduce the risk that special purpose definitions, automated digital services, consumer-facing businesses, that these terms become obsolete. None of us can predict the future. Uber is 12 years old. Elon Musk founded SpaceX in 2002, right? The real lesson of Action 1 and Pillar 1 is that we should plan for obsolescence. The economy changes, it changes in ways we don't expect, and so we should try and anticipate that. So that's one thing that the United States got, is generality. And you can think of all the other countries as losing on that issue, right? Because to the extent that it's more general, it doesn't specifically target US companies, and then more countries have to sort of give up on a residence basis this amount A. So, in general, market states are the big winners, because the amount A is going to be reallocated from mostly, not exclusively, US headquartered companies, and therefore the United States as a resident state, to the market states. But this idea that the market states are the winners doesn't mean that the U.S. is a loser. It's not as big as a loser as it might otherwise, or it might seem, because although the U.S. is giving up a Mount A in a residence capacity as the home state of the headquartered companies, these big tech companies, the United States also has a large, wealthy consumer market. So the U.S. is going, some of that income that gets allocated away from the United States is going to get allocated right back to the United States. So consumer states, market states generally are winners. The United States also won on, I think, on the revenue threshold. So it's very high. It's $200 billion in global revenue, which is much higher than the digital services taxes. Those thresholds are typically 750 million euros. So this reduces the number of companies that will be affected. And because most of those companies are US companies, that just reduces the impact on US companies. Even if that threshold goes down to 10 billion, that's still way higher than the digital services taxes thresholds. Similar in Devereux of Oxford looked at the 500 biggest companies to determine how they would be affected under Pillar 1, and under their estimate, only 78 companies would be affected of those 500. So, that small number is going to make administration simpler. There's a way to roll this out that's more of a trial.
Okay, well, it sounds like the United States didn't do too bad then, because we're a huge market. I forget what the exact statistics are, but we're something like 5% of the global population and 20% of global consumption. I mean, we're huge consumers, so that sort of bodes well for us. Now, another interesting thing in your article, Professor, is you're talking at one point about the European Union and how if you go back and you look at the international consensus, there's this back and forth between source countries and residence countries. And there's a theory that the source countries, which are sort of poorer countries, aren't doing so well under a lot of these bilateral tax treaties that grow out of the international consensus. And that sort of goes on for a long time. But with digitalization, you sort of get to the point where big European countries like Germany and France now see themselves as the source country, and they start to feel the same sense of vulnerability, if you will, or the same sense of injustice, that, hey, we're not taxing all the profits we really want to tax because of the way these rules are set up. So there's an issue. Couldn't the EU sort of do this just within their own 27 member block? Couldn't they have sort of their own version of corporate tax harmonization? And you write that was problematic for them because of sort of technicalities of EU law. And that's kind of how this got kicked to the OECD. So that's a long-winded question that goes to why is the OECD driving this ship?
Yeah, so the OECD in Europe, and how does this work together? So, Pillar 2 was pushed from the beginning by German professors and politicians, but it's not really a European proposal in the sense that there are plenty of countries in Europe that oppose it. And so that's kind of the problem. So, under EU law, yes, the countries could adopt a digital tax, for instance, or adopt a harmonized corporate tax. That is possible. It's legally possible, but the votes aren't there. So in order to have EU legislation, all of the member states have to agree. That includes Ireland, that includes Luxembourg, and they could not get that consensus. So there actually was a legislative proposal for a Europe-wide digital services tax that failed. And for a long time, there's been a legislative proposal to allocate corporate income within the EU according to formulary apportionment. It just doesn't have the votes. And so you could imagine, right? So it is possible for Europe to have a harmonized corporate tax rate as a legal matter, but not at this point as a political one. So I think that the motivation to sort of move the question to the OECD comes from the possibility that, well, so first of all, on Pillar 2, you don't need everyone to agree. You just need the big headquarters countries to agree. So it actually makes sense to look outside Europe because the biggest headquarters country is the United States. And the United States, Bob, you were talking about the Kennedy administration in subpart F, right? So it's long been the policy of the United States to encourage other countries to have CFC regimes because we had one. And any country that has anything that functions as a minimum tax wants other headquarters countries to have the same kind of thing. And so here, so you see like the big countries of Europe, Germany and France have a natural alliance with a country like the United States. And what they're trying to do with Pillar 2 is cut out Ireland and cut out Luxembourg, which is why Ireland and Luxembourg don't want to vote for these proposals when they come up within Europe. So I think, the GLOBE, right, that acronym comes from a German proposal, but it's very much, it's a proposal that has support within and without Europe, and also opposition within and without Europe.
Okay, so Europe does not necessarily speak with one voice on that. And it's telling. Ireland, as you mentioned, they're one of the few countries of the 139 countries that make up the OECD inclusive framework. They're one of the holdouts. The tally that I have on my notepad here is that 133 of the 139 countries in the inclusive framework are good with this, but Ireland is not yet on board for the reasons you just explained. Now, my initial thinking when you take Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 and you think about, well, which appeals to which countries, and sort of my knee-jerk reaction was that only big countries like the United States are really going to be interested in Pillar 2, and like you said, France and Germany, and maybe the United States isn't really that keen on Pillar 1, but in order to get Pillar 2, maybe you have to go along with Pillar 1. That mentality just doesn't seem to hold water. It seems to be breaking down because, as you point out, so Nigeria and Argentina, not countries that you think of as traditionally rich countries, okay, not G7 countries, they've been complaining that the threshold rate, the proposed threshold rate for the Pillar 2 global minimum tax, a rate of at least 15%, isn't necessarily high enough. And that, I mean, I did a double take when I read that, and I didn't realize it until I'd read your article, but I looked it up and it's true. They've complained that the rate should be higher. So can you help work through this for listeners and for myself? What's in Pillar 2 for the less developed countries?
Okay, so, I'm going to respond to this question in a way that is overly simplistic, right? So we're talking about very complicated negotiation that has been agreed now by 130 countries. It's completely impossible to say, what are all of their desires and to characterize those in a way that's, fair to the complexity and the nuance there. But just, this is what I say in the article, right? So just a really overly simplified view of the situation is you can think about 3 different groups of countries. So group 1 is high tax countries, whether developed or developing, that already have significant inbound investment activities by non-resident companies or companies that are headquartered elsewhere. These countries have found themselves engaged in tax competition with other countries, and real factors of production may be moving to lower tax countries, and this is more significant from a policy perspective, or more problematic, paper profits may be shifting while nothing about the actual activity changes. So these countries, the high tax countries, the countries that have the activity now, want a floor, right? A floor rate to put a limit on the competition and to discourage the profit shifting, to make it not worthwhile. And then for them, it's best to do this cooperatively, right? This is why France and Germany are seeking out the United States, right? That they have similar interests in this sense. They both want to cut out Ireland. Okay, so these countries want to form a cooperation, right? Opponents would say a cartel, in order to set the tax rate at a certain level. Now, why do you have a cartel? You have a cartel to reduce competition. Who's your competition? Well, that's the companies in group 2. These are rich, low tax countries, right? Countries like Ireland, Luxembourg, Switzerland. These are the countries that would oppose and sort of the natural opponents of minimum taxation, because they're the up-and-comer competitors, right? So they're competing, mostly for paper profits, to some extent also for real activity. And they want to be able to have as low a rate as possible, and they want it to matter to the multinational that they have a low rate, so that they don't want their low rate to be taxed away, soaked up by some other country. But then there's a third group of countries. These are poor low tax states, right? These are the countries that are trying to attract new investment, new business activity, and they may not have a lot to offer in terms of workforce or natural resources, and they want to have a low tax rate to attract inbound activity, right? So what Pillar 2 may principally be about, right, is Germany and France and the United States against Ireland, right? The countries in group 1 against the countries in group 2, but as a sort of a casualty of that dispute is the countries in group 3, who now can't compete, but they're not just poaching paper profits, right? And if they're poor, it's not obvious that they should be losers out of this negotiation among the rest of the countries. Okay, so there's stronger consensus on the proposition that the countries in group 1 ought to be able to cut out the countries in group 2 than there is on the proposition that the countries in group 1 should be able to cut out the countries in group 3. Okay. Why should those countries not be able to use the full force of their sovereign powers to attract inbound investment? So, your question started with Nigeria and Argentina, right? And if Nigeria and Argentina are saying that the rate is too low, and they are, that has to mean that they identify with group 1, right? That they have the inbound investment and they want to tax it at a higher rather than a lower rate, and they feel that they're being outcompeted by other countries, and they want to reduce competition. Okay. So, that's very oversimplified, right? And you could put a lot more nuance into it than that. But we just have to understand that there's lots of different kinds of countries with lots of different kinds of needs. And so, yeah, there may be some surprises when we find out which countries are for, which countries are against. I mean, when Ireland doesn't sign up, that's not a surprise, right? So.
I got a little worried there when you used the word cartel, because my training is as an attorney, not as an economist. But what I do remember is that when I was studying macroeconomics and the word cartel came up and we started studying OPEC, there was this suggestion that this is sort of something that merits some kind of a scrutiny. You have to be careful if cartels get too much power or too much clout. I mean, I guess you're using the term a little bit loosely.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of depends on, your views on tax competition, whether you think that it's productive or unproductive. Is it a race to the top or is it a race to the bottom? Does it discipline governments? Does it beggar thy neighbor? Countries that are thinking about minimum tax, it's a floor, right? I mean, there are going to be countries that'll be above, and but there just can't be countries that'll be below, and so they're maybe trying to find a middle way. But if you really care about the countries in group 3, right? So the developing countries that want to use a low tax rate to attract inbound investment, then one way to do that is with the substance carve out, right? And so we don't know what the substance, if there's going to be a substance carve out, we don't know what it's going to look like. But if this were your concern about the developing countries, then you would want to make sure that that substance carve out targets the kinds of inbound investments to those countries. So you wouldn't want to have your substance carve out based exclusively on something like R&D, that's, things that traditionally take place in richer countries.
Just fascinating, the interplay between these countries and which pool of those three categories that some countries might see themselves in. That really is going to be fascinating. We're going to have to wrap up, but I have time for one more question here. So I wanted to get to what was my single favorite line in the whole article. You wrote, and again, paraphrasing you, the true surprise of the July 1st statement from the OECD Inclusive Framework is that it exists at all. That's really the biggest surprise. Can you elaborate on that? Because I mentioned before that I was a skeptic, that I didn't think this would ever get this far. And reading between the lines, it sounds like you may have been skeptical too, and yet here we are.
Well, I mean, I don't think you have to be a skeptic, a strong skeptic to think that 130 countries are not going to agree about anything in international tax. I mean, that is the expected result. That's merely being rational. You don't have to be skeptical. But, I think nothing has been signed, right? We don't know what's going to happen exactly. But what we see are repeated commitments to cooperation, to multilateral efforts. And I think that that's really important. And I think that it's something the countries have learned through the BEPS 1.0 project, right? That cooperation works, it can work, but even on a very large scale. But also, this is a sign of the times, right? Countries can no longer go it alone in international tax, and they know that. So in a sense, it's surprising, but in another sense, you might say, how could it be any other way, right? If you want to have both an efficient international tax system that doesn't create incredible complexity and massive double taxation, and you want to avoid this race to the bottom, then cooperation is the obvious path. And so I think it's a really exciting time for us to be studying international tax, and we can only wait and see what will happen.
Well, it's a bit of a cliche, but it really does sound like we were at an international crossroads with this. On that note, we're going to have to go. The article, again, is entitled The 2021 Compromise. You'll find a link to it in the materials below. It appeared in the July 26th edition of Tax Notes International. It's excellent reading. I highly recommend it. Professor Mason, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
Want more like this? Subscribe for more tax videos. Special thanks to our executive producers, Jasper Smith and Paige Jones, and showrunner and video editor, Jordan Parrish.